research, but he had a very strong participation in Kyoto and Copenhagen talking about climate. He has been a winner of practically all the important awards in scientific communications, and now he's the president of the National Association of Science Writers. In 2017, I had the opportunity to run across his name when the book Rigor Mortis reached my hands. I enjoyed it very much. I read it. I was astonished with all that information, and I passed the book and I passed the word, and I tried to make it known at the university, since I am already retired. So I took it back to school, and the book is, I suppose, is running around there with all my all the words that I couldn't understand exactly. So they are signal, and I would like to take the book to recover the book and to study all that English again. But anyway, all that I want to say is that I enjoyed the book a lot. I'm very happy, very proud to have you, Richard, here. And that book, particularly, I think that we cannot but talk about it, because it really has a very strong criticism to the type of science that we are making these days. And I think that this pandemic has brought the subject again into the center of the work today, of everyday news. For that reason, then I want to pass the word to you, but I would like to introduce a question in general. That is, if science, after the rigor mortis, after that cold area of poor results in research, if science is going to get stronger in these pandemics, or is it not? Go ahead.
Well, I think that the pandemic is, well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me to be here today. Can you hear me all right? Am I loud enough right now?
It's okay.
Okay. So yes, I will try to speak a little bit slowly, because I have a tendency to speak very rapidly, and I appreciate that makes it maybe a little harder to understand. But if I speak too fast, just tell me to slow down, okay? But to answer your question, I think it is. I think COVID-19 has brought some very interesting changes to science communication, for better and worse. I think. The better part is that I think many scientists these days are putting their preliminary findings out on preprint servers, so their findings are available very rapidly, and I think that is helping to accelerate the progress of science. I also think that it has the potential to accelerate the spread of misinformation as well. Because not everything that goes on a preprint server is correct, certainly. And I think what we are also seeing, certainly in the United States, is a lot of politicization of science. And so there's a lot of deliberate misinformation also that is being portrayed as scientific information, but is actually propaganda. It's false, and it's designed to achieve political ends, as opposed to trying to really communicate honestly what we know and what we don't know. So I would answer your question broadly in those two categories. Yeah.
Okay, then please go ahead with your presentation.
Okay, I thought I would start today by giving you a brief presentation about some of the broader issues, not specifically about COVID-19, but about miscommunication in science. So I'm going to, which we'll talk about COVID a little bit, but mostly talk about the subject of my book, just as a way to sort of frame the conversation that will follow. And I'm going to share my screen here. Okay, I hope you can see that. This is my title slide. I've need to move you guys out of the way. You're blocking the view a little bit. So at any rate, I am, oops. So let me talk about three different types of misinformation that I think we'll be talking about much more today. And the first I've already mentioned, which is deliberate misinformation, and that is, it has political aims, it has cultural reasons, it's a big problem that I'm only going to touch briefly in my PowerPoint, but I hope we can talk more about that in the broader conversation. The second kind of misinformation from science is I call sloppy science, which is scientists not taking really adequate care to do their studies correctly. And the result is that they are publishing things that are really not up to good scientific standards. And very often those turn out to be wrong. And I'll have more to say about that. And the third type of misinformation is, let's remember that even normal science doesn't get everything right. That's perfectly normal. That's the part of the scientific process. Not every idea, not every paper, even if the science is done carefully, comes to the correct conclusion. So we need to be aware that even when we read something in a scientific journal, that we shouldn't just assume that it is correct. There may be accidental misinformation in there, even from some research that has been done with great care. So let me talk about some of the background on this. This is a paper that was published way back in August of 2005, and John Ioannidis, who is a pretty well-known critic of scientific methodology, published this essay in PLOS Medicine called "Why Most Published Research Findings Are False." And it's a very provocative essay. He basically says that the way science is done these days, in most cases, scientists do not choose very large sample sizes. They make a lot of assumptions that are many of which may be necessary to make when one frames a study. But basically, his argument is that because so much of science is underpowered, is his word for it, the findings actually don't hold up. And if you were to do the same study again, you very well might get separate results. And it's because we don't have limitless resources. We cannot always use 1,000 people for a study. We can't always use 1,000 laboratory animals for a study. In fact, we rarely can. And so the result is that people try to structure their science in such a way as to minimize that as much as possible and still get results that are kind of true, or they hope will be true. But the result, in his view, is that most of the time that actually does not end up being the case. And so he made this rather dramatic claim 15 years ago. It did not get a lot of attention beyond other scientists like him who study and specialize in scientific methodology, but but over the years, people have returned to this study time and time again to talk about these issues as a way of framing what we need to do differently in science. Here's another major study that came out that also raised some objections. And I think this one actually caused a lot more public conversation than the John Ioannidis study. The chief author of this paper, it's a commentary really in the journal Nature, was Glenn Begley. And Glenn Begley was the head of cancer research for Amgen, which is a very large pharmaceutical company. And his experience as running that was that they were always trying to find new ideas from the scientific literature to see if they could develop into drugs. And what he found over the years was an exciting new paper would come across, and they would take a look at it. The scientists in their drug company laboratories would try to reproduce the studies, and they couldn't. Basically, they just decided this is not working out for us, and they would put the paper aside and move on and wait for the next idea that came up and hope that the next idea would pan out. Well, as Glenn Begley describes in this paper, which was published in 2012, he decided when he was, after being head of this cancer research at this drug company for 10 years, he was ready to leave, but he wanted to go back to some of the papers that he thought were most interesting, and if they had worked out, would have led to interesting drugs quite possibly. So he went back and identified 53 studies that he thought were quite interesting and quite exciting, and he decided to try to reproduce them. And this time he actually enlisted the aid, in many cases, of the scientists who did the original studies. So he would go back to the universities and say, we're having trouble getting this work to work. Can we try it again? Can we come to your laboratory? Can you show us? Can you help us? And in many cases, he got cooperation in that. And what he reports in this paper is that of those 53 studies that they tried really hard to reproduce, they were only able to reproduce 6, which is 11%, a pretty poor success rate. And so this paper, along with another one by the Bayer Drug Company that came out at about the same time, basically said, attention, we have a big problem here with the reproducibility of biomedical research. And I should stop here and say that the particular kind of research I'm focusing on today is preclinical research. This is research that's done in the lab in biomedicine. This is not research done by and large on human beings, and it's not the clinical research. Clinical research actually had quite similar problems back in the 1990s, and so some of those problems have been successfully addressed. Some of these problems continue to persist, but my focus today is really talking, or in terms of this sort of discussion here, is talking about the preclinical research that is important because that's where new ideas in medicine come from. And if most of those ideas turn out to be wrong, that really complicates any effort to develop new drugs and find new drug treatments and so on. And people sort of wondered whether I was going out on a limb and being too critical of the scientific enterprise. And my answer is no. I think some of the people within the scientific enterprise recognize this is a very significant problem. One of the people that I've talked to over the years quite a lot is Dr. Francis Collins, who is the director of the National Institutes of Health. It's the organization that provides about $40 billion a year to support biomedical research. It is the main source of biomedical research funding in the U.S. And Dr. Collins himself has been very upfront about talking about the fact that this is a significant problem for the enterprise. He could have just said, oh, this is a bunch of people exaggerating and it's nothing to worry about. But instead, he's actually said, we need to face this, address this, and figure out how to make biomedical research work better. And in a paper that he wrote with his chief deputy, Lawrence Tabak, they wrote, we all know that in the long run, science is self-correcting, but he and Dr. Tabak wrote that in the shorter term, the checks and balances that once ensured scientific fidelity have been hobbled. I mean, this is the director of the National Institutes of Health in the United States. So again, this is not just a few people complaining about problems. This is a recognition that there are issues throughout the system that everybody needs to focus on and find ways to correct. And I might say the NIH can't do it alone. Individual scientists can't do it alone. Universities can't do it alone. Everyone has to work together, and it's a very tricky thing because the incentives that are set up in science, unfortunately, do not encourage people to correct these problems. And we can talk about that more as the talk goes on. I also wanted to mention that this is not just in biomedical research. This is a paper that was published in Science about 5 years ago. And this was a group of social scientists in psychology who decided to go back and look at 100 studies that they had, over the years, had accumulated that were interesting to them, that had got people talking. And they said, we're just going to go back and look at these 100 studies and see to what extent we can reproduce them. So these scientists fanned out and they tried to reproduce these 100 psychology experiments. Very often they are, recruiting a bunch of college students and getting them to do things, and these are not necessarily the most carefully structured scientific studies, but this is sort of the bread and butter. This is of psychology. This is sort of the way psychological research does a lot of its really basic research. And they went back to try to reproduce these 100 studies, and they found that most of them actually did not reproduce well enough to give statistically significant results. About 2/3 of them basically did not actually support the original research findings. Some of them suggested that it might be right, but they didn't come back strongly enough to say that we have confidence that this is a result that is true. And in fact, a significant number of them, something like 1/3 of them, actually came to the opposite conclusion of the original paper. And so this was a call to action also in the world of social science, that something is not working well in social science, and this is not just a problem for preclinical biomedical research, but it's a problem in other areas of science. And I might say that the National Academy of Sciences here in the United States has done a broader survey of science and asking how broadly this is a problem. And every field really can point to some problem with reproducibility in their field. Some do better than others, but basically this is an issue that everybody throughout the world of science really needs to pay attention to. Back in May of 2016, the journal Nature decided to do a survey. It was not a very scientific survey, but they surveyed their readers and said, do you think there's a reproducibility crisis? And as you can see in this graphic from their results, more than half of scientists surveyed say, yes, there's a significant crisis in reproducibility of science. And 38% said, yes, there's a slight crisis. I'm not sure exactly what that means, because it seems like it's a crisis or it isn't a crisis, but 38% said, yeah, it's a crisis, but it's not that big a deal. And another 10% said, I don't know, or I don't care. And I think this really shows that there's been a growing awareness and concern about these issues. Now, I don't like to use the word crisis, and whenever I use it, I try to use it in quotation marks because other people use the word. Because I think it's not really a correct description of the problems we're facing right now. This is an awareness of issues that have been part of science for many, many years. And I think there's some additional pressures now that maybe have amplified them a little bit. But I think the idea that science was working just fine and that all of the published results are believable before a certain date, before this crisis happened, it's simply wrong. What this really is this is a recognition that we need to think more carefully about how to interpret science and scientific publications and scientific communication. And I think that's a good thing, because once people are aware that there's an issue, you can start to address the issue. So I prefer not to use the word crisis, but I think it is the reality is that there are issues that we all need to pay attention to wherever we are, whether we are communicating science ourselves, either as a journalist or as a scientist writing a paper, or if we're interpreting what we hear in the news or read in a scientific paper. We need to be cautious about drawing conclusions. So what types of information are there out there? I will talk about the deliberate, I think, quite a bit more after this slideshow, so I will only say a couple of words about it. But clearly it's a political, certainly with COVID, it is a very political issue, because certainly the President of the United States has been trying to convince the American public that this is not a big deal, that it's going to go, there'll be an easy solution, it'll go away quickly, and nobody has to worry about anything. And to the point where he was even suggesting at a press conference at the White House that maybe people could just inject themselves with bleach or shine ultraviolet light inside their bodies to kill the coronavirus. And as you can see, this is this is a report from my network about that, and one of our reporters went and talked to the New York City Poison Control Center, and they discovered that more people were calling in, actually concerned about whether or not these suggested remedies were safe, or maybe even in some cases asking what to do if in fact somebody had tried one of these ill-advised suggestions from the president. And I mean, this is the most extreme example, but certainly we've heard a lot about how the president and his people had dramatically overpromised the effects of hydroxychloroquine, for example, as a treatment for the coronavirus. And there have been many other examples of that. And it's been a huge challenge for us as science journalists to deal with this. I must say that my colleagues who cover politics regularly have had to deal with an incredible stream of misinformation from this White House. The Washington Post newspaper has counted well more than 20,000 false statements that came out of the president, and most of them not science, but it is kind of his method of operation. It's like, it doesn't matter if it's true or not. He says what he feels like saying, and that can have very significant consequences when you're talking about a health crisis. It can affect people, individual health, and can obviously slow down the government's response, et cetera, et cetera. So deliberate misinformation has been a huge problem in the coronavirus episode here, and we'll have much more to say about that, I'm sure, as Jorge and I talk after I'm done here. I want to say a couple of words about sloppy research as well, because I think that happens more than we would care to think about. And I will give one famous example. Henrietta Lacks was a woman who was diagnosed with cervical cancer in 1951, and she went to the Johns Hopkins Hospital in Baltimore for treatment. And they didn't tell her, but they removed some of the cervical cancer cells from her, and they managed to grow them up and create the world's first immortal cell line. And there are large ethical issues with what they did without informing her, without providing any help to her family, et cetera. And that story is a pretty well-known story. It's a pretty dramatic story about science not done correctly. I should say science not done ethically. But the less appreciated part of the Henrietta Lacks story is that her cell line ended up being so incredibly growing so much better than almost any other cell line out there that it basically became a huge laboratory contaminant. And people, if they had two cell lines in their lab, just one small, tiny error, and all of a sudden the other cell line would be overtaken by what they were called the HeLa cells. And it was it happened time and time again, and created all sorts of real problems of contamination. And I remember back in the early 1980s, I was a reporter, and a paper came out in one of the major scientific journals about this, talking about how often these contamination issues happen. And I thought, oh my goodness, this is going to be such a huge event in biomedicine because so much research has relied on the cell lines over the years. What's going to happen? Are we going to see, countless retractions of papers? Are people going to have to throw away a huge amount of the scientific literature? How are people going to change their practices to make sure this doesn't keep happening? And the answer is, it was just essentially ignored. It was quite shocking to me that basically the scientific community said, oh, well, this happened. We're not going to talk about it. We're just going to keep going on as though nothing had ever happened. And a couple of years ago, scientists decided to try to measure the consequences of that. And this is a paper that was published in PLOS One by some researchers in the Netherlands. And they decided to try to figure out how big a deal this was. These cell lines that were something that people thought they were maybe studying lung cancer or liver cancer or melanoma or something. And it turns out that their cell lines were actually these cervical cancer cells. And so they said, well, how many cases of this are there? And they found 30 almost 33,000 articles based on misidentified cell lines, and they estimate that and then those papers, of course, got referenced by other papers. So there are more than 500,000 other papers out there that reference these and sort of take at face value that these are HeLa cells, or these are not HeLa cells, they're something else. And so they say that basically a huge amount of this literature has been contaminated, and the problem in their view is getting worse, not better. And it is shocking to me that scientists to this day continue to not check their cell lines to make sure that what they think they're studying. Back in the early days, it was fairly hard to do. You had to look at each cell line under a microscope and look at the bands on the chromosomes to see if they were what they thought they were. But these days, you can run a very quick and inexpensive test to see whether your cell line is the cell line you think it is. And the NIH is now requiring that of scientists, or expecting that of scientists, but clearly to this day, people are not doing a careful job of this. And partly it is people just borrowing a cell line from somebody down the hall, another laboratory that may have been contaminated a long, long time ago, and instead of trying to purchase a clean cell line that may be costly from somebody who's actually tested it out, they just assume that their cell lines are what they think they are. And this is just an example, in my view, of sloppy science these are errors that don't have to happen. And if people are just a little bit more careful, that none of this really should have happened, or if it had happened, at least scientists should have said, I'm retracting my paper, I now realize that this was a contaminated cell line, and so on, and try to get the paper out of the literature. But almost none of that has happened. And I should mention that HeLa is one cell line, but there are over 400 cell lines that are misidentified. Many of them are actually HeLa cells, but there are tons of other ones out there. There are many others out there that are infected by or replaced by different cell lines. And there are this group called the International Cell Line Authentication Committee has identified more than 400 cell lines that are not what scientists think they are. And some of them are actually not even human cells. They are cells from other mammalian species that scientists assume are a particular human cancer cell. So this is an issue that just could and should be dealt with by the scientists themselves. But the fact that this continues to occur, I think, is a prime example of sloppy science. This is another kind of sloppy science, which is not being very careful in the methods you use. And I'll give just this one quick example. It's called harking, which means hypothesizing after the results are known. So a scientist gathers their data, they analyze it, they figure out what's interesting, and then they say, from this data, I will generate a hypothesis, and the data will support my hypothesis because I already know that that's the case. And at first glance, this doesn't seem like that big a deal because it's kind of handy to have your data in hand to decide what to make of it. But let me use this cartoon as an illustration of why it's a bad idea. And this is if you imagine that the arrow is the hypothesis, and the little girl is the scientist. The scientist launches their hypothesis, and as you can see, if you wait to see where the arrow lands, you can always hit your target. So this is essentially what happens is if you wait to look at your data before you generate a hypothesis. Now, there are times when it is valuable to do that. If you're actually trying to figure out what hypothesis to test, you can look at a bunch of data. But you shouldn't then turn around and say that data supports your hypothesis. You should say, I've generated a hypothesis with this data. I'm going to do a new study. I'm going to collect new data, and I'm going to see whether the hypothesis is actually supported by the data I generate. Because chances are, you might have 20 different ideas, and some of them the data will match some of them just by chance. And the only way to know whether that's actually what's going on or not is you need to start over again. And that's a very common mistake, another example of sloppy science. Now, let me just say a couple of words about normal science, because not all normal science is perfect either. I mean, science is hard, right? Everyone who is in the field knows that that there's lots of natural variability. There are many, many reasons why things don't always work out the way you expect them to. In fact, they often don't. And the one example I'm going to give about this is this famous paper from 2001. Nature published basically the first really complete draft of the human genome. And this paper, of course, was highly celebrated as an important milestone in biology, but Nature didn't publish 3 billion base pairs in the journal. Nature asked the people who had done the sequencing, pick out a number of surprises that you came across or conclusions that you drew from now that you have had a quick look at the human genome. And from that, we got the estimate of how many human genes there are. It was pretty impressive how few there were compared to how many people I think a lot of were expecting before the genome was actually sequenced. But one of the conclusions in this paper was they reported that some of the genes that are in the human genome actually had come directly from bacteria into the human genome. And this isn't supposed to happen, right? I mean, viruses can convert their genetic material into genes, and that can get inserted in a human genome. But bacteria don't have any known mechanism for doing that. So it seemed pretty surprising and exciting conclusion that they reported that there are bacterial genes that had recently been injected into the human genome, not over evolutionary time, but in recent times, as though they had some sort of virus-like mechanism. Well, that turned out to be wrong, and we discovered that rather rapidly because this other group of scientists also looked at that. And I use this as an example of the importance of transparency, of sharing data in science, because of course the human genome was published, not only the data were published in GenBank, a federal repository. So anyone could go and look at the data themselves and reanalyze it. And this group of rivals, essentially, of that original research group did exactly that. They looked at the human genome that was saved in GenBank. They reanalyzed and they said, there was an analytical error. These 40 genes that supposedly jumped from bacteria into the human genome. Actually, it was an error in analysis, essentially. And these things happen, right? I mean, some of the best scientists in the world sequenced the human genome, and they still got that wrong. And these scientists were then able to come along and say, "Oops, you guys made a mistake, and now we get a publication in Science, and we corrected the record here." So this is part of the normal part of science, where you want, where an idea has to be tested and examined. And it also talks about so much the importance of transparency, not just to say what you found, but to share your basic underlying information. And often now there's increasing calls to share the computer code that people use to analyze their data as well, so people can look for errors in their computer code. And I think this is an example of normal science where that paper had some misinformation in it, but the misinformation was able to be corrected rather rapidly because the data were available. And if it's an exciting enough idea, people are going to be able to quickly or will have enough interest to go out and try to reproduce the results and see if they can do it. So what can we do about all of this? I think the first thing we can do is certainly, in the case of deliberate misinformation, we can call out those deliberate bad so-called facts. And there's an art to doing that. You can't, if you simply say so-and-so is wrong to say, the president is wrong to say that disinfectant can be injected in the human body to affect the coronavirus. There's the people who study proper scientific communication say what you need to do is create what's called a truth sandwich. And the first layer of the sandwich is you say what is true, which is like disinfectant should not be injected into people because it won't help. Then the second part of the sandwich is the incorrect part, which is even so, the president has suggested that might work. And then the third part is then to repeat the truth. This is the truth sandwich. First, you say the truth, you say what the incorrect statement is, and then the third time you come back and you say what the truth is. Because people Otherwise, if you just repeat something that's untrue, that actually has the effect or can have the effect of reinforcing it, even though your said is not true. People hear it often enough and they start to believe it. So people who are talking about how to deal with these deliberate misinformation is a key idea is use this idea of a truth sandwich. I think what can we do in terms of the sloppy science? I think we all also need to be more skeptical of results, and I'd be interested to hear how people are, feel about when they read a paper. Do they mostly believe it's true? Is it sometimes true, or they never believe a paper that's not from their own laboratory? But I think it is important not to dismiss everything, but to be skeptical, to think carefully about where could this be wrong. And I think that that's something that I as a journalist do a lot, and it's a critical part of my job. And I hope scientists do that too when they are reading papers in the literature, because there are mistakes that could be deliberate, they could be sloppy, they could be accidental, they could just be normal science, and those things get the sooner we understand those and can unearth the problems, the better off we are. And finally, I think we just need to accept that that science does not always give us perfect answers the first time around, and that's not bad. We shouldn't be yelling at scientists for not getting it perfect the first time. We need to accept that as part of science, and then we need to think about how to make sure that the system that we have created for scientific communication is geared up so that we can quickly understand where things are wrong and quickly set things right, and have that happen. It's not an easy process, because even when scientists call out an error, very often it's published someplace else in the literature that scientists may not find, and it's a significant issue because it perpetuates errors unless scientists really can be aware of that. So at any rate, that's the end of my prepared presentation, and I would be happy to, I think we will now be able to continue with a broader conversation about these issues. So.
Okay, well, thank you very much. That's very clear, wide, and interesting. I want to pass the word to Francisco. He said that at the end, he was ready to make his participation.
Yeah, thank you very much, Richard, for your presentation. I just thinking about what are the causes that are affecting this reproducibility. I remember a few years ago a paper by Dr. Arturo Casadevall, now at Hawkins, that we in science, we the scientists believe that rejection of the paper are most due to, we can't reproduce this, we have a problem with this experiment, but not directly misconduct. And what Arturo found is that we are misconducting science. We are committing fraud for science. So this is quite difficult to explain, because we scientists are trying to look for the truth, right? Then you find that all this misconduct, all this rejection is not due to, it's directly because bad behavior of science. So
yes, I think that
difficult to explain.
It is, but let me explore that a little bit, because I've talked to Dr. Casadevall about these issues, and what he focused on was largely scientific retractions. There is no question that there is some fraud in science, but most scientists believe that these kinds of errors and these mistakes and so on are not mostly deliberate. There is some deliberate errors in there, but most of the errors are actually just innocent. They're sloppy, or they're just because science got something wrong. There was something that they didn't fully understand, or they didn't interpret something correctly. But Dr. Casadevall focused on corrections in the literature, and most people, when they make a correction, just kind of I mean, first of all, it's hard to make a correction for your career. It shouldn't be. I think that that's one reason that it's so hard to correct the scientific record, is because a correction is seen as a black mark, as a bad thing on your record. And so scientists are incredibly reluctant to have corrections. As I mentioned with the HeLa cells, thousands of those papers should have been retracted, or at least had corrections appended, and none of that happened because scientists didn't want that bad mark on their record. And it's unfortunate that that's the way science regards them. But in fact, the result is that the few corrections and retractions that do occur, and I think Arturo was looking at retractions, as I recall, that those are really the worst cases, and people may pretend that it's, this was just a mistake, sorry, we're withdrawing the paper, or there was an analytical error. But Arturo Casadevall and his colleague in Seattle at the time basically said when they looked more deeply at it, they saw actually many of these corrections are probably the result of fraud, and people and people are just pretending that it was a boo-boo or whatever. It was not an honest explanation of why they retracted their paper. But I mean, it is, and so I think he highlights an important element of this. And I think, but I the lesson from that research was that we should really not. If you correct or retract so few papers, you're basically it does really make it seem as though it's a really, really bad thing, and partly because people do know that it can be a mark of fraud. And I think the scientists need to somehow or other come up with a new attitude about corrections and retractions, and saying science isn't always perfect. Let's admit it. Let's when we made something wrong in a paper, we should say, this isn't right, please don't use it in future research. But unfortunately, that just doesn't happen.
I couldn't agree with you more. There are beautiful examples of people that go back to his paper and try to explain what happened in those papers. And that's derived in new papers published that not only retract what they publish, but they also discover novel aspects that are influencing these bad results. So that is very important, as you mentioned, that we should not be afraid to retract some paper or to go back and see what is wrong with this paper. I think it must be done.
I agree. And unfortunately, you have to change the attitude of your fellow scientists about what it means. And so that's something that has to happen as a community, not an individual. Unfortunately, an individual stepping forward right now, risks damaging his or her career by doing that. And that should not be the case.
I just want to change. I want your opinion, because we in Latin America and all over the world, we are deeply concerned about the United States and United Kingdom and other countries that are examples for all the scientists. In the case of the United States president, in the case of Boris Johnson, in Latin America, we have also Bolsonaro, that all these countries always are good example of how conducting science, how science influence political decision. How can you, as American, as a people from the States, how can you view this process, and what do you think about it?
It is very disturbing for us as well. I think that scientists themselves, by and large, even government-funded scientists or scientists who actually work for the federal government, still really want to tell the truth to the American public. It tends to be the politicians who want to twist the science as opposed to the scientists themselves. But scientists get tremendous pressure from politicians to say things, particularly if there's somebody like the head of the Food and Drug Administration, who's a political appointee, who is a scientist and who's responsible for making science-based decisions, but who also has to answer to his boss, who's a politician, the person who runs the Department of Health and Human Services, which oversees the Food and Drug Administration and the CDC and the National Institutes of Health and a bunch of other important agencies. He's a former corporate lobbyist. He's not a scientist, and his responsibility is to make his boss happy, and his boss is the president. So we struggle with this. And I think one place, as journalists, we want to make sure that when we're hearing words coming out of the mouths of these scientists who also have this political part of their jobs, that they're telling the truth. And if they aren't telling the truth, we do as journalists call them out and say, this is not true. This is not supported by the facts. This is a politically motivated situation. I think the vast majority of scientists at the NIH or the CDC or anywhere else, I think, are horrified by attempts to twist their results and politicize them. But it's but they're stuck in that situation right now with the current administration. So we do think a lot about this and as journalists and how to try to convey when things are truthful and not. One place, of course, there's been this discussion is around the vaccine development, because there's a vaccine or several vaccines are in advanced stages of development, and the president keeps promising that there'll be a vaccine, in a couple of weeks. And of course, we keep hearing from scientists that we're not promising anything to anyone. We'll have to see what the results are before we can say that there's an effective vaccine. Obviously, the situation's a little bit different in China and Russia, which seem to be proceeding with vaccines in the absence of that data. But in this country, at any rate, we are trying to be very vigilant about making sure that, if the president declares that there's a vaccine that's ready, does the science actually support that? And that's a tricky situation. It's created a very unusual circumstance, which is that the industry, the companies that are making the vaccine are usually held to account. They have to prove to the government that their products are safe and effective before they can be approved. These companies are now stepping forward and have stepped forward and said, trust us that we won't even ask for permission until we can prove that to ourselves. And so in some ways, the watchdog role has switched to the companies as opposed to the Food and Drug Administration, which is supposed to be the judge, essentially have the companies done good enough job. So the companies themselves are trying to say, we're going to protect the public too. It's not, yes, we'll make a lot of money when these vaccines are available, but we understand the stakes of getting it right first. So it's a peculiar circumstance, but it's a very upsetting situation for people within the United States, not just around the world. It's not just, I think it concerns everybody.
Richard, I want to say something here. Well, I think for us scientists, it is not impossible to accept that science is not perfect. But do we accept that we are not perfect? We scientists?
Well,
because I think that there is a lot of self-esteem so much built into being a scientist that it is us who think it is impossible to accept that we are not perfect.
Well, I hope that we all recognize we're all human beings and we all make mistakes, whether in our professional lives or our personal lives or anywhere else. I think that it would be unreasonable for anyone to think that I can operate without making errors. I think we all, in any realm, and I hope that scientists deep down recognize that as well. But this does get somewhat to the question of incentives, because I think scientists really do need funding to keep their labs going and their research going, and so they are always having to convince people that what they're doing is great and fantastic and interesting and so on. And so there are incentives for people not to be totally honest, maybe even with themselves, about any errors they're making, because it can affect their careers. We should be able to say, scientists should be able to say, I'm a scientist, I'm going to make some mistakes, but by and large, I'm heading in the right direction, and I'm making discoveries that are going to help society as a whole. And so don't be too hard on me if I make a mistake. I'll admit I made the mistake and I'll move forward, and that's a healthier way for science to proceed. Unfortunately, the systems of funding, and certainly in this country, are not set up to support that. Scientists really feel like they have to be doing consistently unbelievable research in order to keep getting funded, because there's so many people competing for research dollars, and there's just not enough money to go around. Many excellent research proposals just get thrown out because there's not enough money to allocate. So unfortunately, maybe scientists personally will tell themselves, I'm not a perfect human being, but I think the way the system is set up is you kind of need to portray yourself as a flawless scientist in order to keep your career going. And I think it's an expectation that is harmful.
Okay, I was glad that you mentioned that psychological research and communication research, I suppose, I add, have some problems too, because the causes that you describe in your book about a lack of research money and the type and the structure of stimuli for publish or perish, and so on. So it is true for all sorts of disciplines in science. So do you think that all science may be somehow infected with this type of problems these days?
I think no science is perfect. Let's start there. I think there's some areas of science where a lot of, some of this comes down to measurement error, how you measure something. If you're doing a psychological experiment, you measure something by interviewing people, by sending questionnaires. You put them in a situation and you see how they respond. And there's a huge amount of variability when you do that, because people are different. Same is true to some extent, maybe a lesser extent, if you're doing experiments in mice. Mice are, one mouse is not identical to the next mouse, and the circumstances where they're even, caged might vary. And so you have to, recognize that there's natural variability, and part of the art of doing science is to make sure you can account for that. There are some areas of, physics or chemistry where measurements can be made extremely precisely, and so you can make them again and again reproducibly. So there are some areas of science where you don't expect these kind of measurement errors, and so I think that the sense I have is that there are places where the errors are not of that kind. Sometimes what happens in those fields, though, is people will make an error in analyzing in publication. They will put it into a spreadsheet, and what they get out, there'll be some error in the spreadsheet, and so what they see coming out is not what they expected. But the general sense I have is that the problems are biggest in areas where there's a lot of variability and where you really need large samples and really careful consideration of bias, because if you're even looking at cell lines, you may be looking visually for evidence, and if you're doing an experiment and you're hoping to get a particular result, and you're looking at your control set, you don't want to be seeing whatever you're looking for in the control set, so you may say, oh, I really don't see anything here, and if you're looking in your experimental results, you really are looking hard for what you're hoping you're going to find. And so one suggestion is you can blind that part of a study. You can say, instead of doing that yourself and knowing which is which, ask somebody else in the lab. Don't tell them which is which, but have somebody else in the lab actually do that kind of visual inspection to try to gather the data so people aren't biased. It may not be a conscious thing, but these kinds of biases creep in everywhere. It's a major feature of human beings. We see what we want to see, and really, on some fundamental level, science is about finding ways not to fool yourself. You have to think of ways of all the potential sources of bias that you can think of, and there are hundreds of kinds of bias. Think of as many as you can, and ask yourself: is the experiment set up to avoid those kinds of bias? And that's a challenge, but I think that can also help if you take the extra time and effort to do that. That can help a lot.
Okay, there is a question if this pandemic has uncovered some gaps on research that we should do.
Yes and no. I think one example I have from the United States is that there's been this general sense, there's been an awareness for a long time that a pandemic had a serious potential, and that we should really have the systems in place, and we should do the research that we need to do in order to be prepared for it. And so, for example, there are some systems that had been set up to quickly produce a vaccine, for example, if a new agent came along. And I think that the funding for that has come and gone over the years, but and so there are lots of things that we kind of wish we had kept doing to prepare for such a moment that we did and we didn't do. There are, I mean, we'll have to see, but I think one of the most interesting examples of this, which might be a success, is the idea of being able to rapidly produce an mRNA vaccine based on just a quick genetic analysis. The idea of the Moderna vaccine that's being tested here in the United States is basically, you don't need to spend a huge amount of time trying to inactivate a virus and doing all the kind of standard old vaccine development tricks that have been used for decades. But the idea was they created they call it a platform. Basically, it's an ability to take a messenger RNA from any novel virus and try very rapidly to see if that can be turned into a vaccine. And so that would be quite exciting if that were to be the case. And I think that's an example of one area of science where actually we were thinking ahead and we were being prepared. I think another area where we did not do such a good job was there was also a recognition that there should be stronger systems to be able to develop drugs in a similar way. You don't know what your next virus is going to look like, but you can have sort of generic systems set up to try to come up with drugs or other therapies that could quickly respond. And there were a lot of really interesting ideas, many of which just sort of lost funding over the years because people say, oh, there's no pandemic right now, why should we keep funding this? And in fact, the White House abolished an office that was supposed to be for pandemic preparedness early in the Trump administration because they figured, let's spend the money on something else. So I think we're going to learn a whole lot about the way to think about doing science. I think that those are encouraging things. The other encouraging thing I find is the preprints, which I mentioned earlier. I think having this very rapid scientific communication is on balance really good, because I think it is accelerating our broad scientific knowledge of what's going on here. I mean, it took these tough circumstances, but I also think that it's likely that the whole scientific publishing industry, which is a multi-billion-dollar industry, has been resisting the idea of preprints and for a long time, and wants to maintain, make sure that people have to pay to see data and new results and so on. And I think that is likely to crumble. We're seeing that already falling apart, and there's a push internationally to start to insist that scientists make their publications of open access so anyone around the world can see them. And I think COVID has accelerated that. So in terms of sort of the institution of science, I think those are good. I think those are good things, and they're ideas that had been bubbling along. But when COVID came along, people realized this is a gap, and we really need to address it. And so those are just a couple of examples.
Okay. Does anybody in the
Richard,
coordinating group has a question?
Yeah, Richard, I want to discuss about this. How can we do in the universities? For example, I was thinking about the free art programs, the Rigor Reproducibility and Responsibility program, in the Hopkins also. I think in Harvard is a similar program. Do you think it's important to have all this program in putting back philosophy, as Arturo said, putting back philosophy and all these general aspects in science in order to avoid these misconducts, avoid this crisis of reproducibility?
Yes, I actually think that everyone needs to think about how to do this better. Arturo Casadefal is really thinking, as you say, about putting the philosophy back in the PhD, right, and getting people to think more thoughtfully about how to conduct research and how to teach scientists science. This is a conundrum I'm not really the right expert on, but I know that that in biomedical research, in preclinical biomedical research, if you're going to become a research scientist, there's very little coursework and curriculum for you to learn correct methodology. It's interesting to me that in the world of psychology, there's actually a lot more taught. If you're a graduate student, you get a couple of years of methodological training. You learn how to use statistics and how to design experiments and so on. Not that the results are necessarily better there than biomedicine, but some disciplines recognize it's really important to do that. I think the conundrum or the problem in biomedical research in the university is that you're expected to learn from your mentor, and your mentor really wants you in the lab to produce results. So they're even though they're nominally as a student, the professor who's your boss probably thinks of you as labor force, right? You're doing the work. And so they don't want to spend all this time to have you go off and take courses in learning how to do, statistics and methodology. They want you at the bench producing results for their papers so that they can keep their grants coming and so they can keep their labs going. And I understand the motivation for doing that, but it basically graduate students become cheap labor, and they're not necessarily put in the role of having to learn. You're just supposed to pick it up by seeing what other people around you are doing, and if people around you are not doing the right thing, that's what you'll learn. And so I think this gets back to a systemic problem in the way higher education, certainly in the United States, works, and the idea of having this huge labor pool and postdocs as well. Basically, they're people who don't get paid very much and do a lot of the work, and they are just seen as the workers and not as the students, and that's a problem.
Well, that point was perfect. I was just thinking here that I have a proposal, because the postdoctoral training, which is nothing academically, but having somebody working for you, actually we could put some thinking in postdoctoral training, and maybe go back to the philosophy, to the ethics, and in order to try to do out of the postdoctoral a real program, a real academic university program, which I understand as so far, and many years ago I read, is the worst academic program in the whole school, from zero to postdoctoral. Postdoctoral is just having somebody to work because he doesn't have any other thing to do, or whatever. Maybe we have to go back to the structure of academic degrees, and back to the room, to the classroom, in order to learn and to teach how to think more.
Yeah, we must stop to creating specialists. We must create citizenship philosophical doctor, as the title says.
Right. As opposed to just technicians, which tends. I mean, people learn technical skills. I mean, I'm sure people do learn how to do get new ideas about how to conduct science when they're a postdoctoral researcher. So I'm sure that it's not a completely wasted effort for their own intellectual development, but it's not focused either. And I leave this solution of this to you in academia to figure out how to make that work, because I also understand that classroom time is a challenge for particularly for labs if they're trying to be producing results. To have their graduate students off taking classes somewhere is not helpful.
I want another question, Richard, regarding to the media communication media. We talked about this in the last forum. You are a radio person, right? The media is changing a lot. The introduction of television and now all the social media, Twitter, Instagram. How do you view? How can we use all this classic media communication. I love radio, for example. I always give the example of what happened in Chile during the earthquake we have in 2010. Radio was the most wonderful communication media that helped people during the earthquake. Nobody has access to television. We don't have television, and radio become what nobody thinks. Everybody thinks that radio just finished with the cable television. What do you think? We talked with Daniel Silva, a journalist from the television, Chilean television, the importance of bringing bringing information to this social media, Twitter, Instagram. What do you think about the different communication media, and how can we reach all the audience, not only television, not only written press?
Right, and it's changing very rapidly, obviously, and I think that one of the big challenges for me as a science communicator is recognizing that as more and more of these places where information is distributed come up, it makes it much harder to convey a message to the public, to the general public, to everybody, because people are not. I mean, National Public Radio has been around for 40 years. We have a very loyal audience. We have probably 30 million people tune in to what we broadcast in a week, which is pretty good, but it's also about 10% of the American public, right? And getting that other 90% of the public to listen to what we're saying is unrealistic. If you look at television, you have, people have started to divide up what they watch based on their politics. So if you're a conservative, you'll be watching Fox News. If you're a very liberal person, you'll be watching MSNBC. If you're kind of in the middle of everything, you might be watching the traditional television networks. And newspapers are similarly, becoming less and less of a vehicle for information. Certainly in the United States, we've seen local newspapers in particular are shutting down, and it's becoming, the economics of it are so difficult that it's just become a huge issue. My concern about social media is, is that people follow people whose opinions they reinforce their own. So if you're a Fox News follower, you'll follow one bunch of people that are basically likely to be viewing the world from that perspective. If you're a New York Times reader, you'll maybe following the New York Times reporters and hearing the world from their perspective. But the problem is it actually makes it much more difficult to get people to agree on what is truth, because some of these organizations are putting out things that are not truthful, but and certainly social media makes that much, much, much worse. So it's not just enough to say I'm a scientist and I should tweet. The question is, who's going to be following you on Twitter? And it's going to be people who presumably are, who agree with you. And so it's a much deeper problem than just the fact that, that we wish to have larger audiences. The problem is that information is getting so broken up into pieces, and people create their own reality or perceived reality. And so talking about misinformation, I'm sure many people are unaware of how much of the information they're consuming is misinformation, because it's a source that, for whatever reason, they've decided to trust.
Maybe it's not misinformation, but indoctrination. If you look at the newspaper that you like, because it's in your own way of seeing politics, left, right, center, whatever. So you get indoctrinated, and every day, and information is not indoctrination. I don't know if it deserves any kind of comment, but I also would like to know from Richard, scientific journalism worldwide, what is the situation today? Are we working on increasing the amount of scientific journalists, and improving also teaching for this type of endeavor? And how many? This is a kind of a rhetoric. or maybe almost stupid question, but how many scientific journalists do we need?
Well, that is a tricky question to answer because I think that back in the day when the news media were dominated by 3 major television networks and a couple of big newspapers, you could argue that, if you could get your information on those key networks, that basically you didn't need very many journalists for covering broad issues that of scientific importance. I think local journalists have been incredibly important for following things like local environmental issues, or knowing, being able to talk about local resources, which hospital you can go to, and things like that. And so I think that that's the other end of it. And there's always been, newspapers have always had some reasonably good science journalists covering those kinds of issues. But as newspapers have been disappearing, we're seeing less and less of that local information. I think one thing that my radio network is trying to do is we have several hundred member stations that are scattered around the country, and we're actually if people want to listen, about 95% of the people in the United States could turn on a radio and find our signal somewhere, but that's not a realistic way to approach them. So just because people are not going to tune to the dial and just sort of try to find a new source of information, that's hard to convince people to do. But one thing that the National Public Radio is doing is we are distributing a lot of our information on the web, and our local member stations are as well. And so the hope is that for people who are still who just need unbiased information, they can at least come to our website or the member station's website and learn what's happening locally. I think there is to answer your question more broadly, I think there are many excellent science journalists around the country and around the world. I've met from many around the world, and I think there's an interest in it. There have been a series of world conferences of science journalism that have helped draw out the talents from around the world in these areas. And I can't speak broadly about the quality in one region or another, but I think in a general sense there are I do judge journalism awards, and only in English language, unfortunately, because that's the only language I'm very skilled in. But I see great journalism from around the world, great science journalism from around the world in English. So I think that the resources are there. The real issue is connecting people who need information to that information. It's not enough to know that there's a great newspaper in some city that is producing this. The question is how can people access that information, and how do we steer them to information that's correct as opposed to information that is biased and is not accurate. And that's a much more difficult issue. I mean, communication is not just dispensing useful information, but it's also creating that relationship of trust. And so having people actually seek out the information that you're producing. And I think we're still doing there's still many people producing excellent material. The question is how to get people to choose that as opposed to material that is not accurate. That's hard.
Francisco, Juan Carlos, do you have any questions, comments?
Yeah, there is a question here in the chat. Richard says, talking about scientific journals, can you talk about publishing bias? Science supposed to be evaluated by peer review.
Yeah, publishing bias. I'm not quite sure where to start with that. I think that I think part of it is that there are a couple of things I could say. One of which is that if you're some of the big flashy journals like Nature and Science and Cell really look for exciting new findings, and I think that can. That's understandable, but I also think that biases them toward things that are not just is not just whether the research is solid, but it's whether it's also flashy. And I think that has a negative impact sometimes on scientists just trying to do work that's really quality work. And they figure, if my career depends upon getting this published in one of these big journals, I have to make it seem bigger than life. And I think that's a difficulty. I think more broadly, we could talk all day about all the problems with peer review system, but I think one thing I can say about that is that very often peer reviewers want to see things that validate their worldview, and so if you come up with a paper that does not meet what they believe to be the case, they'll be much more harsh on it than they would be on something that supports their own biases. And I think this is good and bad. I think that science shouldn't quickly, discard some idea when a new one comes along. I think we need to be very careful to make sure that if some new, exciting, different way of looking at the world isn't just an error, because it very well could be. So I understand the desire of scientists to say, if you're going to make some big claim, you better really prove it, or I'm not going to let it get published. But I certainly have seen, papers languish for many, many years because they couldn't convince the journals that this was true, because it went so much against the way the field sort of thinks about something. And when you have an exciting idea that's true, that's incredibly frustrating. When you have an exciting idea that's wrong, well, it's just as well that there are some natural breaks in the system to slow things down, to make sure that the literature isn't flooded with things that people then don't have a way of coping with. But so I think, you can clearly come up with examples. For example, the discovery that peptic ulcers were caused by a bacterium and not by just stress and these other ideas. The people, some of those famous experiments had a hard time getting published because scientists said, oh, that's just ridiculous. I'm not even going to believe it. It doesn't fit my worldview. But it, of course, turned out to be correct. But for every one of those that turns out to be correct, I bet probably 10 of them are wrong anyway. So you need to find the right system in publishing to be a gatekeeper, but not to keep the gate totally closed to new ideas, to figure out how to let in the right ones and not let in too many of the wrong ones.
I do have a question.
Yeah.
Richard, the health authorities they must give certain information to the people and to help to fight all this, in this case, a pandemic. But journalists also have to transmit that information. However, they are receiving information from other places. So how do you do this junction between public health and journalists to make sure that people will receive the information they need?
That's a very interesting question, because it's different now than it ever has been. Traditionally, during a pandemic like a flu outbreak or something like that, journalists have played somewhat of an unusual role in that we have become basically the mouthpiece to convey this public health information, as opposed to just being, one of our major jobs is to be the skeptical watchdog and not to just report what anyone says, but basically to question things and to say, these people believe this, but here's some critics who say otherwise, and so on. In public health, traditionally, our coverage has been we have become more of a branch of the public health enterprise, and it has usually worked out very well. I mean, when like Dr. Anthony Fauci would stand up during the Ebola outbreak and say, here's what we know, here's what we don't know, and basically he had a public health message to convey. I think that the most important job of journalists at the time was basically to make sure that we transmitted that message as well as we could, because we had reason to trust the public health authorities at NIH and the CDC and elsewhere about their information. Their job was to be really careful about this information and to put out good, clean information, and they generally had done that. up until recently. This situation is more difficult because we've had to become more skeptical. For one thing, the government has made it more difficult for us to talk to people sort of lower down in these agencies who are more removed from the world of politics. The scientists who really are the subject matter experts who know what's going on. It's very difficult to actually talk to them now because the government wants to restrict the information flowing out of these agencies. And so we have accordingly become more skeptical and more careful. And when we hear something, particularly from a political appointee at one of these agencies, we spend more time and more effort reporting to talk to academic scientists or scientists in industry or elsewhere to see whether whether that's based on really good science as far as anyone can tell. Sometimes it's hard to tell because they're making statements based on government data that other people don't have ready access to. But we are very aware of that and find ourselves in a tricky situation to make sure that we convey important public information, such as the importance of wearing masks or of washing your hands, and these kind of very standard and sensible public health measures that is important for us to amplify and to spread and to make sure that people are doing what they can to help stem the epidemic. But at the same time, we have to recognize that we have to be that not everything coming out of these agencies should just be reported on without question.
Richard, in the last forum, we talked with Daniel also with the importance of education. That's the only thing we have. United States is wonderful in examples, and you have all the problem you have in the 70s, or I think in the 60s, about education of creationism versus Darwinism. And I don't know how to say it exactly in English. I bring this to this discussion because maybe what is happening now in the United States is the consequence of what happened in the 70s, that you opened education. So what about Darwin? We don't care about Darwin. We start movement to teach creationism in schools in the United States. And this was allowed by the Supreme Court in the famous Epperson versus Arkansas trial. So how can we go back to school, not only in one school, in all the school? I know that they are not, it's quite difficult to explain, but vaccines works. That's a fact. Mm-hmm. So can we teach another position? Can we teach that vaccines is not working in this case? So that's the problem we are having now. We need education, but we need education based on science. We don't need the freedom of a speech to be all over the problem we are having now with the misinformation. What do you think about this?
It's a complicated issue. I think that by and large in American schools, certainly in public schools, evolution is taught. There are some occasions where people may talk about creationism, but it is generally not part of the curriculum in these states. We do teach science in our science classes by and large, but let me take this back a step and say that evolution is an interesting example because it is unique in the way that people see the world. People who have a deep religious background do not accept evolution. They believe that they believe in biblical creationism, and you cannot. People who brought up in a faith that believes that are not going to be by and large convinced otherwise by a science class. But it's also an interesting phenomenon that social scientists who studied this in the United States have found that people can believe that God created the Earth in 6,000 years or whatever on the one hand, but also believe in most of the other stuff and so they'll reject evolution, but they'll accept, many of them will accept vaccines. They accept the fact that physics explains why airplanes stay in the air, why drugs work, and a lot of the other science-based things. It is possible, and it happens all the time, that people are able to hold unscientific ideas about evolution, but accept the science in many, many other areas. And so I think that in some ways, we have to recognize that it's not an all or nothing thing, that people with deep religious convictions can sort of set aside certain things and say, okay, I don't believe science here, but I believe it everywhere else. And that's encouraging to me. I think part of the problem is maybe not around the issue of evolution as much as some of the anti-vaccine efforts in this country, because it's not necessarily based on religious belief, it's based on personal prejudices and so on. And this gets back to the broader question of science communication. We can communicate very clearly what the best truth is that we understand it, but people will receive what they hear based on their community. And let me give an example of climate change, of global warming. People basically, if you ask them if they are concerned about global warming or not, their answer will not be determined by how many articles they've read about global warming or how many documentaries they've seen or anything. It will be, what do the people in their community say? And if you live in a community, a conservative community, say, where basically pardon me, where global warming implies maybe you shouldn't drive cars that burn have very poor gas mileage, or maybe we need to act collectively to deal with global warming. That's a philosophical objection some people have. They say, I don't want the government to tell me what to do, therefore I don't believe in global warming. And if you live in a community where that's the very strong belief, you're not going to take, by and large, you're not going to take in information about global warming and say, well, my entire community is wrong. People don't do that. People look to their community for information about what to feel, how to think, etc. And so this is the other part of communication. It is the fact that people come to these communication with their own preconceptions, so their own ideas are from their own point of view, and it's much more disruptive to expect somebody who lives in a community where people believe global warming is a hoax and get them to say, I'm going to read all of these articles and then learn, oh, it isn't a hoax, it's true, because there's no advantage for them in their community, unless they want to go against, unless they want to be sort of the village skeptic. It doesn't benefit them to do that. So I think this is a more broad communication problem that we have. It applies to vaccines too. People develop these sort of irrational fears of vaccines, but there are communities built around that, communities of ideas, and so it's hard to move people out of those communities once they have those ideas embraced.
Yeah, but we have facts, not ideas.
Right.
There are a lot of facts that demonstrate that vaccines works. Right,
absolutely, and most people actually understand that and accept that, but there are people who are, for whatever reason, they don't believe that I'm going against the facts. There's enough people putting out what you might call alternative facts. People are putting out facts that seem to suggest that vaccines don't work, and people gravitate to those explanations, and they believe they're facts, even though we know that those are not valid arguments. People think I'm making a fact-based decision, but their facts are coming from Twitter or from their Facebook friends or something like that. They're not coming from science journalists.
Richard, when I asked you how many journalists do we need, all what I wanted was to give some stimulus to young people to see in scientific journalism, in journalism in general, a great opportunity. And I think that we need many. We need thousands, millions. I've been struck by the idea of the local community, the problem of communication in a local situation, because we're going to need journalists, not communication chiefs in the offices of the mayors and so on, but journalists with the capacity to think scientifically, and they will be the proper people to pass the information to their own community. So that was the point.
Yeah, and I agree with that, but I guess the other question is, you know, absolutely the more the better, but there maybe, that's also how many people, how many people will there be jobs for is the other question. So you don't want to tell everybody to go out and become a science journalist and then discover that all of the newspapers are gone and the radio stations are shutting down and there's no jobs for people. So it's not just a question of asking individuals or us, what they should do. We need to think more broadly about the dynamics of the news business to make sure that there's a place for science communicators. Journalists. It's a critical function, but it's struggling right now just because of the way the news business is.
Yes, but what happens is that we have to change many things. How if we introduce a journalist in every municipality, and maybe we could get out a policeman. We have too many policemen in a town, sometimes, many times, and we have no journalists. Why don't we make a change? It takes change in mentality, and I think that we have to think in another world which is coming soon, where we have more equilibrium on the needs of the people. Now, another point.
Now, for example, now in Chile, there are a lot of people, young people, who just give information in the abroad, information regarding the use of masks, regarding when you have some symptoms, go to the hospital. The driver information. I think that's wonderful. We need some people that drive good information to people. I don't think this is a journalism or another, but I think it's important.
I wanted to make another point is that when is misinformation, infodemia, or infomaniacs, when is it going to become a crime? Because we have had misinformation forever and ever. All the advertising, I don't know if all, but I could think that more than 90% of advertisements are not true. And they pass the information and try to convince people with even with scientific information, they think. And now I heard yesterday in the news that YouTubers are going to have it bad here because they are going to be criminalized if their influence that they are giving people is not addressed as a real ad, and they indicate who is paying for it. And if the consequences of what they are advising is bad, they are going to have to pay for it.
Yes, well, this is a huge problem. There are laws for sure that in the United States that are supposed to limit people from making completely false claims. You can't put an ad in a newspaper and say, come to the store and get free food, or get everything in the store is free or something like that. You can't, and then people show up and of course it's not true. That violates a law, and people can be prosecuted for that. Also, the drug advertising is fairly heavily regulated to make sure that the drug claims are correct, that people can't exaggerate those things. And for example, vitamin pills, you're not supposed to be able to make any health claims about the dietary supplement is, you can't say that, it'll make you bigger and stronger, but companies have found ways to work around that because they say, it supports it supports strength or something like this, which makes it sound like it will make you stronger. But they've had to work very carefully to they can't make the direct statement, but they can, or they get in trouble. But they've figured out ways to try to imply things that they can't state. So it's, as you say, it has always been an issue. Online it is quite interesting what might happen, because right now the platforms like Twitter and Facebook and YouTube are not held responsible for the content that they contain, but there's an interest in changing that. And if that becomes the case, I mean, if all of a sudden YouTube could be sued if somebody puts up a video that's a lie, they're going to have to stop putting up videos, because they don't have the ability to basically to make sure that everything that everyone puts up is truthful. So it's going to, it's part of this fight. Interestingly, I think that these organizations really do want to have some more regulation than they have, because it's such a mess that they've created. They recognize that social media is actually contributing to the decline of democracy in this country, and into the propagation of false information. And they are not particularly happy to be in that role. They're happy to make money off of all of it, but they recognize that they're also responsible for harming the body politic, the public's, the world of civil society, and they want to figure out a way to get out of that. But it's going to be a long fight, I think, to figure out how to try to regulate speech on those platforms, and it's just starting.
We can start by prosecuting Donald Trump. I don't know. I don't have any why he haven't been prosecuted yet. Yeah, we have some questions here. Richard, this how this pandemic is changing the way we communicate, and why I don't know, traditional media haven't lost some credibility now.
I'm not sure that well, I mean, yeah, let's see. I guess I've already talked about the scientific communication with preprints, and I think that's an improvement. That is help for the better. I think there's been a 4-year battle to try to make the news media seem not credible by people who don't like, to the president, for example, who doesn't want to be called out for not telling the truth all the time. And so he's always calling it the fake news media or whatever, and trying to degrade people's confidence in the news media. I don't know to what extent that has been successful. I mean, what I see that's more concerning to me is that people then just decide which news media to follow. If you're a Trump supporter, you're probably going to be watching Fox News, and you're not going to be reading the New York Times or listening to NPR. And so I think that it is accelerating the sort of the breakup of a common conversation. We should all ideally have the same set of facts that all of us can talk about. We can disagree about what to do about the facts, but we should all at least have access to and agree upon, more or less, the facts that we need to debate and figure out what to do with. So I think that this is not necessarily the coronavirus that has caused this problem at all. I think it's the political situation here in the United States that has accelerated this. But this is a phenomenon that has been going on. We see it in our politics, certainly, that the country is more and more gone into just two camps, and instead of being able to sort of say, forget what political party I am a member of, what's the best solution to this problem? That's happening less and less, and it's affecting communication as well, so including science communication.
There are some people that say you can recognize if he's a Trump follower, if they use or not mask. You can see in the States, if he's a Trump supporter, he's not wearing mask.
Well, that's obviously a broad generalization. I will.
I know.
I mean, I ride my bicycle, and when I ride my bicycle, I pull up my mask when I'm passing people, but the rest of the time I have it down so I can breathe better, which is permissible by the laws where I live. That's the recommended course. So you can't always tell, but yes, it is sad that we have politicized the use of masks, and I think that the White House today is seeing the consequences of that with the illnesses now within the White House.
There's a question.
Yeah, Jorge.
If there is a place where we could get the truth, truthful news, could we eventually think of building it in the network? Definitely it's not Wikipedia, but something like that.
That would be great if we could all come to an agreement about what is the truth, but it's hard. It's hard to do. I mean, even people who maybe have politically similar views may have disagreements about. I mean, even when you look at scientists, I mean, there's certainly many scientific issues where scientists have a very different view of what's going on. And that's just part of, we can't know the absolute truth for most things. We have to, we need to weigh what we know and ask how important is it if we're wrong. I mean, come back to climate change as an example. It's like, we can't say with 100% certainty whether a bad storm or whatever is a result of climate change, but we can say that from what most of us understand is that the changes that we're seeing in the atmosphere make these kinds of conditions more likely to create these bad storms. And so, yeah, I mean, it would be great if everyone could sit down together and agree, okay, this is for real. But even something like continental drift, you can, or plate tectonics is the more correct term for that. You can still find people who are skeptical of that. It's sort of a silly example, but there are many scientific issues where it's not clear exactly what is correct, and we have to live in a world of knowing that we do not know the absolute truth. The real question is, how do we act in the absence of absolute truth, and we as a society, and that's a more important question in some ways than
Yeah, I think you're right, but we cannot say what is true or not. We can call out some fake news.
Right.
That's what we must try to focus and call out what is fake news.
Mm-hmm.
We are searching for the truth, but we can say this is not true, this is fake.
Yeah.
And we are failing in doing that.
Right. And when you do call that out, don't forget, use your truth sandwich, right? Say what's true, then say what's not true, and explain it's not true, and then say what's true again, because otherwise you can just be reinforcing false information.
Right.
Okay, there is a question, maybe you have talked about that already in general, but diffusely, maybe since you are very well informed and thinker on scientific journalism, what kind of education, what's the strong part of education that we are missing in journalism in order to produce the type of scientific journalists we need?
Well, I think when I was just starting out my career, many science journalists actually did not have a scientific background. Some of the earlier pioneers in the field were just excellent journalists who were just curious about the world, and they taught themselves science, and that worked fairly well in the early days. I'm talking maybe the 1960s or the 70s or whatever. But by the time I came along in the 1980s, and certainly much more so, most science journalists now have some science background, I would say, and I think it's critical that science journalists at least understand the scientific process, and understand things like we've been talking about today, that a result out of a laboratory is not the final word, it's not the truth, it is an approximation of our best understanding right now, and so on, and understanding the process of how science goes through to figure out to build support for an idea that's good, and to create and to find ways of eroding and getting rid of ideas that are not good, and so on. So that basic understanding is important. What we're also increasingly seeing in this country is science journalists have PhDs, and this is. I think it's generally a good thing because I think they have a very, very deep understanding of science. I think the risk is that that they have spent so much time in science that they've lost the ability to talk to people who are not scientists, because science, of course, develops its own language and its own conventions and so on. And I think people who really get deep into that sometimes are not that able to communicate outside of science. But this is largely partly a consequence of the fact that we're training so many PhDs in this country, and we don't have jobs for them once they're done with their postdocs doing this cheap labor. That there aren't a lot of other jobs for them, and so some, certainly not academic jobs. And I think that a lot of so increasingly scientists are realizing that, well, I can still use the knowledge I've accumulated to do something useful and become a science journalist or science communicator of some other kind, and that has happened. And I think, at my colleagues at NPR, I think at least 2 of them have PhDs now, and we've had a few others that have come through, and they're quite capable journalists, but and they are excellent communicators. We hired them because we knew that initially, of course. But still, most of us still don't have a PhD, and I actually don't think it's necessary. But I think having a really good scientific grounding and understanding of how science works is critical, and also just being a good journalist, learning how to ask questions, learning how to find sources of information, how to talk to people, how to make sure that you have the whole story. Those kinds of things go beyond just knowing the science, but really knowing how to communicate it, how to tell a good story around it.
Well, I think that PhD maybe is not necessary. You are an excellent example that it is not, but a PhD is an opportunity for learning how to think deeply.
Mm-hmm.
In that sense, everybody should welcome a PhD degree, but a scientific journalist with a PhD is not to make of him a biomedical scientist in this case, but a person who thinks deeply and understands and is able to speak out, to use the language in a way that he could get information from science and put it in the public. I think that we, in general, we don't spend enough time in trying to think, trying to learn, trying to discern. I don't know if the word exists in English. What is truth? What is reality? Because we talk about it in a very simple way. We use the word, but we know that we don't know what is truth, but we have to think about what is truth. And in trying to think about it and talk about reality and talk about language and talk about this missing information in the chain, maybe we become a little bit less thinkful of our own capacities and become a little bit more wise.
I agree with you. I think that we should spend more time thinking about these big issues. We collectively, I mean, not everybody has the luxury of doing that. I mean, if you are, just trying to get by, you're not, and you just need some basic information about should I wear a mask or should I not. That's really that's the most important sort of basic information we need to provide. If people are more are more interested, we should be able to tell them more about why do we think masks matter, why do they, and understand sort of the contingent nature of truth, etc. I mean, you can get very philosophical very fast, and I think that you have to be careful that certainly when you're talking about public health, that you don't go there too soon, or that you provide the most basic information to everyone, and then make sure that people who want to know more and who are curious about more can learn more.
Well, we have less than 5 minutes to finish, so I would like to invite you to get our conclusion remarks, if you have some. Again, thank you for being here.
Well, thanks. I actually did not prepare any final remarks. I think it's been an interesting conversation. I've been delighted to. Oops, we're getting some audio feedback here. Yeah, I've really enjoyed talking to Francisco and Jorge about these issues in particular, and obviously we've demonstrated that you can keep talking and talking and talking about these things because there's always something else some other issue to get involved in. Sorry, the feedback is terrible.
Dr. Rosa, Dr. Francisco, do you have any remarks?
No, just thanks Richard for his wonderful talk, and I think we must try to communicate better science. We try to do a better job in the education. I think the education is the only aspect we can try to go to fix this problem we are having now with fake news.
Well, I should say that with this background of rigor mortis, I am pleased that the pandemic may bring an opportunity for science, for the scientific institution to become stronger. I think that I cannot think of how this pandemic would have been if it were not for science. Fortunately, in many countries, scientists were in front of the situation, and in many other countries, science was dismissed. And maybe we can talk about the crisis, Richard, because crisis is a good thing. I think crisis is where it crosses the situation, and maybe from this point we could get an inflection in what's going to happen from now on. I, as a scientist, a retired scientist, I'm happy with science. I invite the young people to embrace science for their careers, and I think that thinking science, thinking deeply, and learning how to think anyway is what we need, and science is a very good vehicle in order to learn how to do that.
I agree with both of your comments, and I think it's, education is so important, and and journalism has an important role, but we can't do it alone. We need people who've learned the basics. I can do only so much teaching when I'm communicating in my reports, but I think that that is such a critical thing, and for people to understand how science works, as you say, Jorge, it's so important that we, how valuable it is, where it can go wrong, and so on, is an important perspective for people, and I spend a lot of my time trying to convey that in the course of conveying information about science to my audience.
Juan, no se oye.
Sorry. Thank you very much, Richard, for being with us today. Thank you, Dr. Francisco, Dr. Rosa. I think that this was very special discussion that should have at least 10 sessions because I think it's very exciting. So I hope to have you in the future on this forum. Thank you very much. And with this, yeah.
I want to repeat the invitation to Richard. He must come to Colombia and give us the opportunity to talk at extent with him.
I would love to do that. Thank you for the invitation.
You're invited to my place. Don't forget.
All right. So now I would like to say thank you again to our scientific committee. Jesus Alonso Jaramillo, Mónica María Lopera, Marlene Valencia, Andrés Felipe Villa, and Diego León Morales. And I would like to invite you to our next forum next week. We are going to talk about COVID-19 implication in the bacterial resistance to antibiotics. So everyone, again, thank you for being with us, and I hope to see you next week. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you very much.